I've recently watched several videos on YouTube about the apparent discovery in 1670 of the hearts of Elizabeth I and her sister Mary I in a burial vault under the floor beside their joint tomb in Westminster Abbey. It's a really intriguing story, but I thought it deserved a more detailed and careful examination of the evidence and some explanation and questioning of the sources. In this video, I first examine the documentary evidence for this story and where it came from, and draw some conclusions about its veracity. I then discuss how it became a standard practice not only for hearts, but all the entrails of royal corpses to be buried separately from their bodies. I will also look at the evidence for the preparation and burial of both Mary and Elizabeth's bodies, and the procedure for the disposal of their royal entrails. It's a cheery subject, I know, but this is a fascinating aspect of royal funerary practice in the medieval and early modern period that is still very little known. Before we address the evidence on 1670, let's first get our bearings in Westminster Abbey and look at the burial location of the two queens within the Abbey church. Elizabeth I and her half-sister Mary I are buried in a small burial vault in the north aisle of Henry VII's chapel, the Lady Chapel of Westminster Abbey, which was constructed by Henry VII and Henry VIII as the Tudor mausoleum. The vault was presumably constructed when Mary died in late 1558, and for much of Elizabeth I's reign the vault was unmarked. Mary had no gravestone, and instead a pile of discarded altar stones were placed on top of it, which had all been removed from the side chapels in the abbey in Elizabeth's reign. When Elizabeth I died, it seems that she was initially buried with her grandparents, King Henry VII and Queen Elizabeth of York, under their tomb in the centre of the chapel, but that King James I later moved her, and her coffin was then placed on top of Mary's. And then James commissioned a monument to Elizabeth, but not really to Mary, over their shared vault. Between 1867 and 1869, the Dean of Westminster, Arthur Stanley, lifted many floors and opened many burial vaults in Henry VII's chapel to identify the occupants. And while looking for the grave of James I in the area to the east of Elizabeth's tomb, the workmen accidentally created a small opening beneath it, which gave a view of the vault's contents. It was a narrow vault, designed for one coffin, but there were unmistakably two within it, and an inscription on a top coffin identified it without question as that of Queen Elizabeth I. The burial vault was not fully opened by Dean Stanley and was explored superficially from this eastern aperture. Now, just to the west of Elizabeth and Mary's vault is another burial vault with numerous coffins in it, and Dean Stanley found that the earliest occupant of this vault was General Monk, Duke of Albemarle, who died in 1670, the man who more or less engineered the restoration of the monarchy. Now, in the 3 YouTube videos I watched, they all claimed that just before Monk's burial took place in this vault, while it was open and prepared to receive his body, a young man called William Taswell went down into it, saw 2 urns containing the hearts of Elizabeth I and her sister, and that he dipped his hands into them. Now, all the accounts I've heard and read about Taswell's trip down into this vault contain some confusion and a bit of elaboration, and none properly reference the source. So I want to rectify that and also tell you a little bit about William Taswell. In 1670, William Taswell was a 17-year-old scholar at Westminster School. Later in that year, he went up to Oxford, and after graduating, he was ordained and had a long career as a clergyman. When he died in 1731, he was the vicar of Bermondsey. Throughout his life, William Taswell wrote in Latin a series of autobiographical anecdotes, and these were left to his family when he died, and they were subsequently translated from Latin into English in 1761 by his grandson, the Reverend Henry Taswell. The original Latin text of the work didn't survive, but the 1761 text was still extant in the 19th century, when it was further edited and was then published by the Camden Society in 1852. Taswell's autobiography was considered worthy of publication primarily because it contained an eyewitness account of the fire of London, written by the then 14-year-old Taswell in 1666. So looking at this source, what does Taswell say about his curious experience in General Monk's vault in 1670? The first thing to note of importance is that he says the vault already existed before Monk's death. It isn't a newly created vault. Taswell refers to it as the Royal Vault. Perhaps it was one constructed to contain future royal burials. And he says that he found 2 urns within it, one appropriated to Queen Mary, the other to Queen Elizabeth. He doesn't tell us how he knows this. He describes how he dips his hand into each of these urns in turn and pulls out some of the contents. He says nothing whatsoever about the urn's contents other than describing the consistency of the material within. Each contained, he writes, a kind of glutinous red substance, somewhat resembling mortar. He records that the one that was believed to be the urn of Queen Mary contained less moisture. He doesn't mention anything at all about the urns containing the hearts of the queens, which is what most videos and articles have seemingly focused on. Now, given that there was moisture in the material, hearts usually shrivel up fairly quickly post-mortem, and that the urns were big enough for Taswell to dip his hand into them, what he appears to be describing are not heart containers, which are generally quite small, but most likely a pair of urns of the sort that were used in the early modern period to contain the viscera, the entrails of an individual removed when a body had been embalmed. More on that process in a second. They were usually relatively large, as they had quite a lot of material to contain, all of the internal organs. Now, in this engraving of the interior of a royal vault on the opposite side of Henry VII's chapel, containing the remains of Charles II, William and Mary, Prince George and Queen Anne, you can see their visceral urns at the foot of their coffins. They're the funny little boxes that look like commodes. Taswell doesn't state in his account which Queen Mary or which Queen Elizabeth these urns belong to. The assumption is always that they were Mary I and Elizabeth I, given the proximity of Monk's vault to their vault. That is not necessarily the case. There were, of course, 2 Queen Marys and 3 Queen Elizabeths buried in Henry VII's chapel. Mary Tudor and Mary Queen of Scots are buried there. Elizabeth of York, Elizabeth I and Elizabeth Stuart, the Winter Queen of Bohemia, also find their resting place there too, and all would have required visceral urns for their entrails. When Dean Stanley opened General Monk's burial vault in 1867, he saw in it several ancient urns, and 2 of these, one square and one circular, are shown very clearly beside Monk's coffin on Stanley's plan of the vault. John Dart, writing in 1730 in his West Monasterium, an account of the history and monuments of the abbey, had also been into Monk's vault. He doesn't mention seeing urns for Elizabeth I and Mary I, but does say that he saw there an urn that belonged to Queen Anne of Denmark, the wife of James I. On the top of the lead urn was written in clear letters, Anna Regina, and the date of her death, 1619. Now, Dart and Stanley were both meticulous scholars, and had they seen the urns of Mary I and Elizabeth I in the vaults, they would surely have mentioned them. Stanley, in particular, took great pains to identify the coffins and receptacles within each vault in the abbey. And my conclusion is quite simply that young Mr. Taswell was mistaken. There are indeed good reasons to believe that Mary I and Elizabeth I entrails were buried elsewhere and not in Westminster Abbey, but I'll discuss that presently. So, why were the entrails of English kings, queens and other prominent members of the royal family and nobility removed and enclosed in visceral urns? It is a tradition that goes back at least to the 12th century and was common in both France and in England. In the Middle Ages, this practice was undertaken for both practical and pious reasons, either when an individual died a long distance from their intended burial place, or they wanted to divide their bodily parts between different places of religious significance, such as monasteries they had endowed. Take, for example, Eleanor of Castile, the Queen of Edward I, who died in 1290 at Harby in Nottinghamshire, a long way from London. Her body was brought to Lincoln to St Catherine's Priory, which incidentally lies just underneath my house, and there it was prepared for burial. Her entrails were then removed and buried in Lincoln Cathedral. Her body was to be buried in London in Westminster Abbey, and the procession to London would have been a long one, by which time putrefaction would have set in. The decay of a human cadaver usually begins in the intestines, where the naturally occurring bacteria quickly begin to multiply and consume the deceased from within, and removing the entrails aided in the preservation of the body. Eleanor's heart was also removed, but for very different reasons. She wanted it buried in the Church of the Dominican Friars, the Black Friars in London, a monastic house she and her husband the king had patronised. The division of the body in this way gave different focuses for remembrance too, and in the medieval religious system, prayers for one's soul's health were essential to procure, and dividing the body ensured more prayers were procured. In the later medieval and early modern periods, the bodies of members of the royal family often lay in state ahead of their funerals for an extended period of time, often for weeks and months, and to arrest decomposition, the corpses of the social elite underwent a drastic series of measures to embalm them, and both Mary I and Elizabeth I were both prepared for burial in this traditional way. Now, there is a contemporary account of Mary's embalming and funeral among the Lord Chamberlain's records in the National Archives in Kew. The Lord Chamberlain of the household was the official responsible for arranging royal funerals. This record was first published in 1770 in an appendix to a work edited by Thomas Hearne, an edition of John Lelland's De Rebus Britannicus Collectanea. The account of Mary's funeral preparations is entitled The Interment of the Most High, Most Puissant, and Most Excellent Princess Mary, the first of that name, late Queen of England, and it includes an extraordinarily vivid account of her embalming. Mary I died in St James's Palace, and the account says that directly after her death, her body was perused by the Lords of the Privy Council and the Ladies of the Realm. Then the body was embalmed. It was, the account tells us, opened, seared and trammelled. The first part of the process was the opening of the Queen's corpse by her physicians and surgeons, and all her bowels with her heart were removed, and they were afterwards coffined, placed in urns. We'll come back to that in a moment. Secondly, after the surgeons had done their work, came a process called searing, which was undertaken by the clerk of the spicery and the officers of the chandlery. The empty body cavities of the Queen were filled with spices and a fibrous material made from flax called tow, and the Queen's body was then wrapped in layer upon layer of waxed cloth called cerecloth, from which the searing gets its name, cera being the Latin word for wax. After that, the corpse was trammelled. The word trammelled means to tie up or to bind in Middle English, and the corpse, now wrapped in its cerecloths, was then bound up in cloth of gold with silken thread. Then the sergeant plumber, the principal lead worker of the royal household, was brought in, and he then clapped, i.e. enclosed in lead, the body. Sheets of soft lead were formed around the corpse, and the Queen was soldered into a lead shell-like form. Mary I's remains would have looked just like these coffins, those of Henry VII, Elizabeth of York and James I in their burial vault in Westminster Abbey. Then this lead shell, which was an anthropoidal shell that looked like the Queen's form, was coffined in a timber coffin covered with purple velvet and decorated with metallic lace and gilt nails. Once the Queen had been bowelled, seared, trammelled, clapped and coffined, her remains were then airtight. There was little possibility of swift decay and of nasty smells emanating from her corpse, and it was then possible to take time with the funeral rituals. The Queen's remains were then brought into the Privy Chamber in due time to be interred in Westminster Abbey. As for the Queen's entrails and heart, this document clearly describes what happened to those. They weren't taken to Westminster Abbey at all, but were buried sumptuously in the chapel of St James's Palace, the Queen's heart being separately enclosed in this case in a coffin covered with velvet and bound in silver. If this official account is correct, Taswell can't, therefore, have dipped his hands into Queen Mary's urn in 1670. Now, when Elizabeth I died in 1603, she had requested that her body not be opened and embalmed like her sisters. The idea appears to have repulsed her. But according to the witness of her young lady-in-waiting Elizabeth Southwell, Robert Cecil, Elizabeth's Secretary of State, entirely ignored her wishes. She was bowelled, seared, trammelled and clapped and coffined just like the sovereigns before her. Dean Stanley proved without a shadow of doubt that this took place, as he saw the lead anthropoidal coffin of the Queen within her decayed timber coffin. There is no mention in any contemporary source that I found of what happened to the urn containing Elizabeth's entrails. Interestingly, no visceral urns have been found in any of the vaults of late medieval and Tudor sovereigns. The vault of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York at Westminster Abbey contains only their coffins, and that of James I. Edward VI vault in Westminster contains only his coffin, and when the vault of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville in Windsor was opened in the 18th century, there were no signs of visceral urns there either. But we know that all of these individuals were bowelled and embalmed, so their urns had to be laid somewhere. Henry VIII's vault at Windsor also has no urns in it either, but we know what happened to his entrails. They were buried in a lead urn in the chapel of St Stephen in the Palace of Westminster, close to his place of death at Whitehall. Jane Seymour, his queen, is buried beside him, but she died at Hampton Court in 1537, and her entrails are known to have been honourably buried in Hampton Court Chapel. Henry's elder brother Arthur, who died in midwinter in remote Ludlow, was buried in Worcester Cathedral, but his entrails were buried in the parish church of St Lawrence in Ludlow. It appears the late medieval and Tudor practice was to bury the viscera in a palace chapel or church close to the place of death, primarily because they needed to be disposed of quickly before they began to decay. And I think it is likely that Elizabeth I's viscera, including her heart, were in fact buried at Richmond Palace where she died, rather than in Westminster Abbey. It is my conclusion that young Master Taswell was mistaken in 1670. He may have touched Queen Anne of Denmark's heart and entrails, but not those of Mary I and Elizabeth I. Queen Mary's are probably still under the chapel floor at St James's Palace, and Elizabeth I may well be under these houses and gardens that now occupy the site of Richmond Palace Chapel. Now, this isn't a serious suggestion in any way, but wouldn't it be fun to organise a dig at Richmond to try and find them? Thanks very much for watching. If you enjoyed this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.